Okay, so basically, we didn't have a shir last week because of Tisha B'Av. It's getting towards the end of the year. We're getting basically almost all of the Agadata and Avodah Zarah is in the first parak. There's not that much Ein Yaakov in the later prakim. We're getting towards the end of the first parak of Avodah Zarah. There's a whole section of drashot on the first parak of Tehillim, which is Ashrei Haish, and it goes on for a while. So I brought one of them here. We're going to be discussing it, but I'm hopeful that the shiurim after this one will kind of pick up on some things that are a bit more, for lack of a better term, interesting. And there's also one other thing that we're going to be skipping, which is daf chet in Avodah Zarah, which is just this daf plus of all these medical things that the Ein Yaakov quotes, all the medical advice from the rabbis. It's one of the two main places in Shas where they have all the different medicine recommendations. I think the other one's in Gittin and Samech Chet. So that too we're going to skip just because it's all these very esoteric cures and for various maladies. So we're going to be learning this time about drasha in the first parak of Tehillim, and then starting next week it'll be going into the second parak of Avodah Zarah, and we'll be going back to kind of various topics. So to finish off the year. So the first parak of Tehillim is Ashrei Haish, and we're going to be looking at Avodah Zarah and Daf Yud Chet Amud Bet. It's going to give one of, as I said, many drashot that the Gemara gives on how to interpret the parak. And then we'll see just various interpretations or perushim on what the Gemara is saying. And then learn another midrash that's quoted in the Iyun Yaakov, which is a bit unrelated. It's kind of a tangent, but it's an interesting midrash in its own right, which I didn't delve too deep into, but we'll see if there's anything worth discussing there as well. So the Gemara of Avodah Zarah on Daf Yud Chet says as follows: Darash Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, Mai dichtiv asher haish asher lo alach be'atzat resha'im u'v'derech chat'im lo amad u'mashav leitzim lo yashav. First pasuk in Tehillim. Praiseworthy is the person who did not walk in the advice of the wicked, and in the path of the sinners he did not stand, and in the seat of the leitzim, which we're going to be interpreting as the scorners, he did not sit, or translating as scorners. V'chi me'achar shelo alach echan amad, u'me'achar shelo amad echan yashav, u'me'achar shelo yashav echan latz. So the rhetorical question here is, why does it keep going? Right? Why does it say he didn't walk, and then he didn't stand, and then he didn't sit, and then he didn't scorn? He couldn't have done any of those steps if you hadn't done the previous step. You can't stand somewhere if you don't walk there first. You can't sit if you're not standing first. What is the chiddush here? Ela lomar lecha she'im halach sofo la'amod v'im amad sofo le'yeshev v'im yashav sofo lalutz. So it's a chain reaction, right? So the idea is that the reason it says all of them is that it's not just repeating the same thing, but one leads to the other leads to the other, and in the end, you end up being a letz. V'im latz, or letz alav ha'katuv omer, it says in Mishlei, im chachamta lach, v'im latzta levadcha tisa. Right? If you are wise, then your wisdom is for you, but if you scorn, then you are left by yourself. So it's not a good thing to do. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, kol hamtlotzets yisurin bayin alav, shneimar, ve'ata al titlotzetzu, pen yichesku mosrotechem. Okay, Rabbi Eliezer says anyone who is a mitlotzets, who scorns others, gets afflicted. Amalu Rava l'Rabbanan b'matota ba'ina minaychu delo titlotzetzu delo leitu alaychu yisurin. So Rava said to the rabbis, I beg of you, please do not be leitzim, so that you don't have a yisurin visited upon you. It's the same idea again. Amarav katina kol mitlotzets mizonotav mitma'atin shneimar mashach yado et lotzatzim. Okay, so anyone who scorns his sustenance is reduced, or his portion is reduced. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish kol mitlotzets nofel b'gehenom shneimar zed yahir leit shemo oseh be'evad zadon ve'en avera el gehenom shneimar yom evra yom ahu. Anyone who is a scorner falls into Gehenom. Amar Rabbi Yoshai kol mityaher nofel b'gehenom shneimar zed yahir lat shemo oseh be'evad zadon ve'en avera gehenom shneimar yom evra hayom ahu. A similar drasha there that Rabbi Yoshai says anyone who is mityaher, who is arrogant or is presumptuous, also falls into Gehenom. And then back to the drasha of the Leitz. Amar Rabbi Chad Nilai, Bar Chanilai, Kol המתלוצץ גורם כלייה לעולם, שנאמר ותעד לא תצאו פן יחזקו מסעותיכם כי כלה ונחרצה שמעתי. Anyone who scorns causes destruction to the world. So there's just a lot of different drashot here about how terrible it is to be a scorner, and the jump start for it is the first pasuk in Tehillim. The Maharsha has an interesting interpretation here. He says as follows. The Darash Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, he says as follows. V'ha maiti kol hamitlotzet yisurin v'chulei kol hamitlotzet mezonotav v'chulei. So the fact that the Gemara comes and brings all these different drashot, yesh lefaresh b'zeh ki derech osei leitzanut u'schok שעושים עצמם חגרים ובעלי מומין ושואלים על הפתחים בדרך ליצנות ולעגה על אחרים שהם באמת בעלי מומין ועניים. So he says something here kind of interesting, where he says it's the way of scorners. In other words, what is a leitz? What is someone who scorns? What does that mean, and why is it so terrible? So the Maharsha says it's the way of people who scorn and people who joke around and people who make fun of others, that they pretend to be lame or maimed, and they pretend to be schnorrs, and they go around and beg, as a way of scorning and mocking those who actually have to do that, and actually are poor and have physical injuries and have to go and beg. So they dress up and pretend as a way of mocking those people. ואמר כל המתלוצץ בעניין הזה הוא בא לידי כך ולבסוף שיבואו עליו איסורים ונעשה כאחד מבעלי מומן ושואלים על פתחים שמזונותיו מתמעטין. And then that's how the Maharsha ties it to the drashot. It would say someone who is a mitlotzets, that he gets afflicted and also that his portion gets reduced. So it's this idea of midah keneged midah in the Maharsha's mind. He says anyone who does this, so in the end he will himself be afflicted with the very things that he's pretending to be afflicted by, in order to make a mockery of others. And he will be like a Baal Mum, and he will have to beg. And because he was making fun of those people, and then he gets punished to do that, so he gets afflicted by those physical injuries. And then also his portion is reduced because he can't make a good living because of those physical injuries. כדרך שאמרו בסוף מסכת פאה, כל מי שאינו חיגר ולא סומה ועושה עצמו כאחד מהם, אינו מת מהזקנה עד שיבוא לידי כך. So it says the end of Pe'ah, anyone who is not lame or who is not blind, but he makes himself out to be lame or blind, he pretends to be for whatever reason, he will not die from old age until that happens to him. In other words, someone who does something so horrible, so mocking as to pretend to be a person who has to suffer in that way, will himself end up suffering like that before he dies. But then the Maharsha clarifies and says, "V'lav dafka amru ken sham she'oseh atzmo ken sheyeh nireh ke'ani v'yitnu lo tzedakah." So he says over there in Pe'ah, so the context is obviously that why would a person do this? Because he wants to get tzedakah. So a person pretends to be someone who's a misken, pretends to be a shnor in order to appear to be poor and get tzedakah. And that Pe'ah, the Gemara Masechet, or the rabbis in Masechet Pe'ah are saying anyone who does that is going to be punished with actually having to do that. But the Maharsha, we can take that idea and apply it here as well. That for whatever reason, that someone might not do it because he actually wants to get tzedakah, but just because he's a leitz, because he's just a scorner and a mocker, and he wants to make fun of these people. And then the same principle that we have at the end of Masechet Pe'ah, where midah keneged midah, he will end up being afflicted in that way, the Maharsha says applies in our case as well, which is what the Gemara might be teaching us by saying anyone who's mitlotzets will get afflicted and will have his portion reduced. And that's how we can interpret the pasuk that's brought in the Gemara. Right? If you become a scorner, you will bear it yourself. Right? If you mocked and scorned others, right? Through his blemish or something that he's lacking. In other words, you're mocking that person for what he for what he is injured with. So the Maharsha, so that could be a way that we can darshan this pasuk and say, you yourself will bear it. So it doesn't mean that if you scorn others and mock others, then you will have to bear the not in the vague sense that you have to bear that yourself, or whatever the repercussions or the consequences of that are, but literally, levachat tisa, you will bear literally the very thing that you were scorning, which is this injury or this lameness or blindness or etc. etc. So that's an idea that the Marashah has to develop based on our Gemara. The Yun Yaakov, he goes and basically he interprets each of those different ideas, tying them all back to the same concept of Bitul Torah. That he says all of these are really just different ways of supporting the idea that a late to someone who's mevatel Torah, right? That he doesn't just dedicate his time to learning, but he wastes it doing other things, and that all the punishments that are listed of falling into Gehenna and having afflictions and not having a good portion, those are similar to the things that someone who doesn't learn Torah has, and it's basically because a scorner does not learn Torah. And then he brings a specific example, which is kind of interesting. So he says, here, Kol המתלוצץ נופל בגיהינום. So he says, גם כן מטעם דלאל, כיוון שמבטלת מתורה, כבר הראה הקדוש ברוך הוא לאברהם בברית בין הבתרים. So first he says, right, that why does a mitlotzitz end up falling to Gehinnom? So this is also for the reason that we said before, right? Because he's mevatel Torah. So since he's mevatel Torah, so then he falls into Gehinnom just like anyone who is mevatel Torah falls into Gehinnom. How do we know that? That someone who's mevatel Torah falls into Gehinnom? Kvar hara kadosh baruch hu la'Avraham bebrit ben habetarim. Kedita b'midrash lech lecha perek mem dalet. Because Hashem already showed Avraham that concept of brit ben habetarim as it's brought in the midrash. So instead of finishing the Yun Yaakov, because he basically quotes the Midrash, let's read it inside. I brought a slightly different version in the Psikta Rabati, which elaborates a bit more on the version in Bereshit Rabbah. It says as follows: Amar Shimon ben Abba b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, Arba'a dvarim hara kadosh baruch hu la'Avraham Avinu, Torah v'korbanot, Gehinom u'malchuyot. So at the Brit Ben HaBetarim, God showed Avraham 4 things. He showed him Torah, korbanot, and then he showed him Gehinom and Malchuyot, which is like subjugation to the nations. Torah, how do we know that he showed him Torah? In the Brit Ben HaBetarim, part of the ceremony, it describes it as having a lapid ish, right? This torch. So the Torah is compared to, maybe no Eish Dat Lamo, the Torah is compared to a fire. So in the Brit Ben HaBetarim, when there was a fire that appeared, so that was God telling Avram about the Torah. Korbanot, chali egla, right? How do we know korbanot? At the Brit Ben HaBetarim, Avram had to bring all these different animals as part of it. So there's korbanot, Gehinom, tanur ashan, right? So it says tanur ashan velapid ish. That this furnace and fire passes through the halves of the animals that Avram cut in half. So the tanur ashan, which is this furnace, so that's a reference to Gehinom, and then malchuyot, hinei ema chashecha. So this one's a bit interesting. So how do we? And then the 4th one is that God taught Avram about the Jewish people being subjugated to other nations. So that's because when Avram first, before Brit Ben HaBetarim, God brought a tardema on Avram, this very deep sleep. And it's described as this dark dread that fell on Avram. Right? This moment that he had this vision of Brit Ben HaBetarim, it was this dreadful darkness, and so that's a mashal for Malchuyot apparently. So 4 things. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avraham, kol zman shebanecha oskim b'shtayim, hem nitzolim mishtayim. So God said to Avraham, as long as your sons are dealing with 2 things, then they are saved from 2 things. What does that mean? Kol zman shebanecha oskim b'torah v'korbanot, hem nitzolim migehinom malchuyot. So as long as they're dealing with Torah and korbanot, which are good things obviously, so they're saved from the bad things, which are Gehenim and Malchuyot. Ve'atid bein hamikdash lecharev. God says to Avraham, the bein hamikdash is going to be destroyed. V'korbanot libatel, and the korbanot are going to be taken away or nullified. Therefore, you can only cancel out one of the 2, Gehinom and Malchuyot, because this is 2 on 2. You have the Torah and the korbanot canceling out Gehinom and the Malchuyot. But if korbanot go away and just Torah is left, so you have to choose either Gehinom or Malchuyot that won't be nullified by korbanot. And so that's what God says to Avram. He says, God says to Avram, you have to choose. Once the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed and there's no more korbanot, do you want your children to get Malchuyot or Gehinom? That they have a spiritual destruction, or that they're subjugated under the nations? And then the Midrash continues. Rabbi Chanina bar Papa Amar, Avraham birer lo et hamalchiyot. So Avraham in that moment chose that his children, that the Bnei Yisrael should be subjugated, and not that they should fall to Gehinom. U'ma ta'am im lo kitzuram michram. Ze Avraham k'ma da'at amar abitu al tzur chotzavtchem v'Hashem hizgiram she'iskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu imo. Okay, it brings various psukim to show that Avraham chose subjugation and that God acquiesced, and that's why Bnei Yisrael were subjugated. Rabbi Berechi v'Shem Rabbi Reish Lakish. Kol oto hayom haya Avraham yoshev v'tameh b'libo ve'amar eze evror livni zu kasher v'zu kasher. So they describe after Brit Bein HaBetrim Avraham in this crisis where he can't decide what fate to have his children have to go through, Gehinom or subjugation. And he says, they're both terrible things. I need to decide one, and I'm not sure which one is the lesser of two evils. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Avram, ad matai ata yoshev v'tameh, psok hada milechi libcha. Hadu dichtiv, bayom hahu karat et Avraham brit le'emor, ma le'emor, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Avraham bireh lo et hamalchiot. Banu lemachloket Rabbi Yudan, Rabbi Idi, Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. Zaken echad b'shem Rabbi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu bireh lo et hamalchiot. Uma tam irkavta enosh l'roshenu arkevta umya al roshenan banu ba'esh uvamayim. Basically, what the Midrash ends up saying here is that there's a machloket between Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, who says that Avram chose subjugation, versus all these other rabbis, Rabbi Yudan, Rabbi Idi, Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, and an elder in the name of Rabbi, who all say that Hashem actually chose the subjugation. And then Avram was debating, he couldn't decide what to do, and so God says, you know what, I'll choose for you, I'll choose the subjugation. Better that than Gehenna. So, yeah, and with that, without dwelling too much on this Midrash, because I think there's something deep here. I'm not exactly sure what it's saying, but there's some idea about how Brit Bein HaBetrim, like the fate of Bnei Yisrael was decided, and that they were destined in hundreds of years' times to be subjugated, and that was a decision that was made, Brit Bein HaBetrim, as it were, and that there's a machloket about whether Avraham actually instigated that or whether it was something that was decreed by Hashem. So, just wanted to bring that midrash because it's brought by the Ibn Yaakov to bring it back to our context. What does it have to do with what we were saying about Leitzim? So we see from here that, and the Ibn Yaakov uses this as kind of a brilliant proof. Remember, the Ibn Yaakov was trying to prove that the idea of kol hamtlotzets nofel gehinom, that anyone who is a leitz falls into Gehenna. So how do you see that from this midrash? Because the Ibn Yaakov says as follows. He says, the midrash says that it's 2-on-2, Torah and Korbanot versus Gehenna and Malchiot. God says, okay, the Korbanot are going to be nullified. You have to choose Malchiot or Gehenna. And Bein l'Rabbi Yechanim or Papa, Bein l'Kodesh Baruch Hu, the choice ends up being Malchiot, right? That he'd rather that they do Malchiot and that Torah nullifies Gehenna. So Torah is still in existence, and therefore it nullifies the Gehinom. But since the Korbanot are nullified after Bnei Mikdash is destroyed, so that's what brings Malchiot, and that's why Bnei Yisrael is subjugated. So the Yaakov says, see from here that if Torah is nullified, then that means that Gehenna is no longer canceled out by it. And so anyone who doesn't learn Torah, therefore, gets Gehinom. And so if we say Kol HaMitlotzets Nofel Gehinom, that means since Kol HaMitlotzets, anyone who is a Mitlotzets, he does not learn Torah, Bittul Torah, so that ties into this Midrash, where canceling Torah is what ends up leading to someone getting Gehenna, because Torah is not able to cancel out the effect of Gehenna as part of this deal that Avraham made with Hashem at Brit Bein HaBetrim. I just wanted to, close with this last Midrash in Devarim Rabbah, which doesn't talk about mitlotzets, but it talks about an atzel, which is a lazy person. So even though they're slightly different, there is kind of a relationship between them. And it's just, I think, it's like a nice kind of musar idea that I saw in this Midrash, and then also the Mesilat Yesharim has like something to say about it. So it's a Midrash in Devarim Rabbah, Perek Chet, Piska Vav. It says as follows. In Parshat Nitzavim, right, Moshe is talking about the Torah, lo b'shamayim, lo rachok, da. And it says, Ki karov elecha davar mo b'ficha v'lvavcha lasot Torah. Torah is in your mouth and in your heart to do it. It's close to you. So the rabbis learn from here the following. Rabbanan Amre, Shiva Dvarim Amar Shlomo al Ha'atzel. Shlomo said 7 things about the lazy person. Uma She'amar Moshe haya gadol mikulam. But Moshe said one thing which is greater than all 7 of the things that Shlomo said. Ketzad Amru la'atzel Rabcha ba'ir lechu lemad Torah mimenu. So they said to the lazy person, your rabbi is, or your master is in the city, go learn Torah from him. And so this person says, yeah, but there's wild animals on the road. It's dangerous. I can't go meet my rabbi because the lions will get me. Minayin shneimar, it says in Mishlei, Amar Atzel shachal badarach. So shachal is another word for lion. So the lazy person, he makes excuses, right? Or he fears the unknown. He says there's a lion on the way. Amru lo harei rabcha b'toch hamedina, amod velech etzlo. So they say to him, okay, he's not in the city, he's in the province, right? It's not so far away. You don't have to be too afraid. Amar lahen mitarei ani shelo yeh ari b'toch harechovot, shneimar ari b'rechovot. So he says, no, okay, I'm still afraid of the lions, basically. I'm still scared of them, even in the Medina. Amru lo harehu dar etzel beitcha. And so they say to him, okay, your rabbi is staying right near your house, right? He's across the street. Go visit him and learn with him. Amar lahen v'ari b'chutz. But he says to them, yeah, but what if the lion's right outside my house? I can't leave my house. Shneimar amar atzel ari b'chutz. Amru lo b'toch habayit. So they say to him, okay, your rabbi's in your house with you. So he says to them, okay, you say he's in the house, but if I go to my house and I find that the door is locked, then I'm turning around. Amrulo patuachu, they say to him the door is open. Minayin, how do we know? Shneimar hadelet tisov atzira v'atzel mitato. So the door swings on its hinge, but the lazy person stays in bed, right? He won't go. Lasof shelo haya yodea ma le'ashiv, and in the end, the lazy person has exhausted all of the excuses that he can make for himself, that he can make to other people. So what does he say? Omer lahen, o adel patuach o na'ul mivakesh ani lishon od ma'at. He says, okay, you know what? I don't care whether the door is open or closed. Leave me alone. I want to sleep a little bit more. How long will the lazy person sleep? So here we have kind of this idea of somebody who is always kind of making excuses because he is an atzel, he's lazy, and that every time someone comes back to him and says, yeah, but, look on the bright side, or you can do it, so he keeps finding reasons to say no and why he can't do it. And in the end, we find that it was all really not valid excuses, but just not valid reasons, but just excuses, because in the end, he just says, anyways, leave me alone, I want to go to sleep. So I meant to bring it in Hebrew, but basically the Mesilat Yesharim, he has a perek. The Mesilat Yesharim, right? His Sefer is a famous book of Musar, so it's actually based on a Gemara that comes a couple daf after Avodah Zarah Yudchet. It's Avodah Zarah Chaf, where Pinchas ben Yair says that this thing leads to this thing leads to this thing. All right, so the Zirut leads to Zirizut, which leads to etc. etc. And then that's the basis of Mesilat Yesharim, where he dedicates a chapter to each of those things. And so one of the things that he dedicates to is this idea of, he kind of lumps the Atzel and the Leitz together in a certain sense, which is how I came across this. The Leitz is a scorner. It's not exactly a lazy person, but there's kind of some similar, there's a common thread between them. And the Mesilat Yesharim just brought this particular midrash, and he says at the end, kind of an interesting insight, where he says, we see from here, and again, I apologize for not having the Hebrew, but he says, you see from here that it's not, I have it in English, right? That it is not fear which leads to indolence or laziness, but rather indolence which leads to fear. That you might think that, and probably the intuitive way to understand people who are lazy is to say that they're afraid, right? They're afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of the outside world. They're afraid of things that they can't control. And so that fear leads them to be lazy. And the laziness is really just this manifestation of their fear. I think with to kind of apply maybe to the world of Corona, right? That very different people react very differently to everything that's been going on in terms of, first of all, how seriously they take the various regulations, etc., but also just their general approach to how they respond to this Ari Bachutz, right? That they have this thing that's outside, and so are they going to go to the Ir? Are they going to go to the Medina? Are they going to go to Bachutz? Right? Like, what is the the maximum distance that the government lets them go or that they let themselves go. But what the Mesiyat Yesharim seems to be saying, based on this midrash, is perhaps that we have it all backwards in a certain sense. That maybe it's not that the people who are afraid and that manifests itself through like an unwillingness to do things, which can then be seen as laziness, but it's the opposite, as the midrash says, that all the excuses that this person makes about how he's afraid to do this and that, it really stems from his indolence, it stems from his laziness. And that it's really the type of person who has these bad character traits or these midot that the Mesiyat Yesharim says is not good, this atzlut, that leads somebody to be afraid. So he tries to kind of say that that's not a wise thing to do in the footsteps of Mishlei. So, anyways, there's more to say about the Atzel, and the Mesiyat Yesharim brings a whole bunch of other things, but I think that's good enough for this week. And like I said, starting next week, we'll start the second parak of the Avodah Zarah and go back into some more interesting topics.
Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.